Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you very much, Katrin, for the introduction. Welcome to our talk on combining survey data and digital behavioral data on behalf of myself, Sebastian Stier, and also on behalf of my colleague, Johannes Breuer. Today, we will touch upon 3 issues before we get to the Q&A session, which will last for at least 30 minutes. And we really look forward to hear about all of your questions regarding these issues of linking surveys and digital behavioral data. I will start my first block with the question, why? Why does it make sense to combine these 2 data sources? And I will briefly touch upon certain strengths and limitations of each data type, and also give some examples from my research field of political communication to give you a better sense of why this could make sense. Johannes will then take over. He will talk about the how-to. How can we bring together these 2 data types? Which types of research and linkage designs are available? And we will certainly hear about challenges, because this is not trivial. This is something that has been done since approximately 5 to 10 years. And there are still many unresolved challenges when you want to conduct such research. And finally, we will hear about your questions, and we really look forward to engage in discussions with all of you. All right, why should we do that? Why should we combine these 2 distinct data types? We will first start with a definition of digital behavioral data. And here we borrow from Howison et al., who define digital behavioral or digital trace data, how they are also often called, as traces of behavior that are undertaken through an online information system. Therefore, they are regarded as digital. And these types of traces, as you can see on the left, can be collected from a multitude of different socio-technical systems, such as websites, which you will hear about in my first session, about web browsing behavior in particular that allows you to get insights across different socio-technical systems. So web browsing histories, that is a novel data source that is really useful. But classically, we also hear a lot about social media data, such as LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. Google is also an important platform to study, so search engines. And in the future, also in the social sciences, we think that these sensors, so these smart devices, will become increasingly important. And you also see here on the left, apps, different smartphone applications, also these health wearables that also track a lot of behavior in a passive way. And these types of data are really useful also when it comes to linking them with surveys. All right, let's quickly dig into these 2 different data types. I will start with digital behavioral data. So what are the unique strengths of digital behavioral data? Most importantly, they are direct measures, unobtrusive measures of human behavior, which is a clear contrast to surveys. So we can actually observe people's behavior at scale. And usually these data come with high granularity, so also high temporal resolution, meaning we can observe Twitter debates across months and even years. And this is obviously a huge advantage over simpler survey-based designs. While most research in the social sciences using digital behavioral data cannot be regarded as big data, whatever that is, there are also no precise definitions for that term. Usually these data come with high volume and velocity. So they are certainly bigger than the usual survey data set that you download from GESIS, for instance. So with strength, there also come limitations. And the problem with digital behavioral data is, most importantly, in my opinion at least, that we do not have information about the actual producers of this data. So for us, Twitter users are just anonymous nodes about whom we really do not know much. And that is a major issue, obviously, when it comes to answering social science research questions and to make inferences about the broader society. We also do not know about their motivations, what they think while posting, what the effects of posting are on their attitudes, because we cannot survey them directly. And we also do not know what is going on in their lives beyond these digital platforms for which we are collecting data. Surveys have distinct strengths. So we can measure all types of constructs with surveys, and all types of constructs have, of course, been measured with surveys in the last 100 years. So we can measure opinions, attitudes, and even offline behaviors, something like voting. We can access these offline behaviors as well with surveys with limitations, and I will talk about this in a second. And one important strength is also that probability sampling is possible. So we have a clearly defined target population, ideal. So for instance, the population of a country, and with these sampling frames, we can get a high quality sample that is representative, or the opinions that are in this sample are representative of the broader population. That is something that is not easily possible with these online systems that are very opaque to researchers. One problem is with surveys that the self-reports of digital behavior and engagement on these digital platforms are really limited. So they do not work very well because of these problems with recall and cognitive challenges. Obviously, if you try to assess what you saw on your Facebook news feed yesterday, even that is a really difficult task for any human to answer. In some research areas, there are also social desirability biases. So for instance, when it comes to news consumption, obviously it is a good thing and you're a good citizen if you know about ongoing public affairs, and therefore people clearly overreport, for instance, their exposure to news or other types of political information. And as we also all know, these response rates in surveys, traditional probability-based surveys, are declining, and some populations are really hard to reach. For instance, younger people who are particularly likely to engage with online platforms. I will motivate these linking designs with one brief example from the field of political communication that is not just of academic, but also of public interest. So do online echo chambers exist? Are there parallel worlds where people with certain predispositions engage only with like-minded people and only hear about similar political opinions without engaging with the other side, so people from a different party, for instance? If you want to study the phenomenon of echo chambers using surveys, and this is obviously has been and is still being done, you run into measurement problems. And that is something a recent meta-review in the journal Nature Human Behavior showed. These self-reports of media exposure or engagement with digital platforms positively correlate with actual observed behavior on these platforms, but these correlations are really weak and they are systematically distorted. So this is true for different types of devices or platforms, smartphones, social media, general web use. And the problem is that if you use these measures either as a dependent or as an independent variable, if you want to study echo chambers, the validity of your overall findings is really questionable because there's so much measurement error in these exposure measures themselves. So if you want to study polarization, if you want to study echo chambers, you can obviously rely on lots of data from online platforms. And it is no overstatement to say that there are tens of thousands of papers that study polarization on different online platforms. And I just brought with me one example, one really well done, methodologically advanced and much cited study, I think from 2011, that studied political polarization on Twitter. So what you see here is a prototypical network figure that you will find in many of these papers. The blue nodes are Democratic Party supporters, the red nodes are Republican Party supporters. And with the clever methodology, these authors estimated the ideology. So this is not something you get from Twitter, but this is something that they could estimate from the Twitter data that was available. And we see that there's almost no engagement in terms of retweets. So these two camps really live in distinct information worlds. But one problem that arises here, which we call in political science, selecting on the dependent variable, is that the data is really distorted. And the data that was collected here was based on political hashtags. So only people who used a political hashtag at least once showed up in this data set. And who does that? That is obviously a very specific subset of the general, but also a specific subset of the Twitter population. Highly educated, politically interested citizens. And we know that such people have always had a very specific information behavior. So these people are more selective when it comes to choosing certain types of information. And these types of information are typically well in line with the existing predispositions. So we learn here that there are these polarization tendencies on Twitter, but whether we learn anything about broader political system or society from that data is really questionable. So what happens if you bring the two together, surveys and digital behavioral data and measures that go beyond one platform? So we look here at two studies that were conducted with web browsing data. These were very large representative samples of the population whose web browsing behavior was tracked, and they were surveyed for their ideology. So on the left-hand side, conservative versus liberal ideology. On the right-hand side, party ID, Republicans and Democrats. And there's, of course, a huge overlap between these two constructs. And what these authors showed on the left-hand side is that even really hardcore right-wing sites, such as Breitbart here at the right, have a significant democratic or liberal audience. And this is also true for mainstream news sites, such as the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Washington Post, etc. Republicans still go a lot to CNN, even though Donald Trump was always calling CNN fake news. And on the right-hand side, we first need to discuss the x-axis. So this is the political ideology, the media slant of a given media exposure of respondents. So on the left, we see a more liberal media diet, and on the right, towards the pole of one, this is a more conservative media diet. And again, the overall picture is one of moderation, so that Democrats as well as Republicans get most of their news in the middle of the political spectrum. Yes, we see a little bump with Republican Party supporters on the right end of the poll, but still most news consumption takes place in the middle of the political spectrum. And we need to combine surveys, knowledge about individuals, and good high quality digital behavioral data to arrive at these inferences. And these inferences show in this field that these echo chambers are really fringe phenomena, that most people, if you look at the general population, have a fairly well-balanced information diet. I hope these examples helped you to get a better sense of the potential of these linkage designs. And the main takeaway from this part one, hopefully, is that linking data from surveys and digital behavioral data can be used to overcome some of their limitations, not all of them. There still remain biases, but to also exploit their unique strength. And with that, I hand over to Johannes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the question how we can combine surveys and digital behavioral data. And I would like to start with an example of what potentially the outcome of this process can be, in the sense of what could the ideal, in air quotes, data set for the social sciences in the digital age look like. What we typically get when we collect social media data from people is what is in these dashed lines here. So we get a snapshot from a sample, snapshot of from a particular platform, in this case, in this example here, Facebook. And this is from a paper by Resnick and colleagues, where they talk about what social media data we're getting and what we are missing in most of the studies that are out there. And usually we get this snapshot from a particular platform for a particular sample. But of course, people, as you can already see in this figure here, are also active on different platforms. And then if you look at this arrow on the bottom right, you can also, of course, not only collect cross-sectional data, but also longitudinal data. Typically, well, can be done in different ways, and I'll get to that in a bit. But you can collect data over time as well, so you don't only get a snapshot from one particular point in time. If we're also interested in additional information about these individuals, then we need to get the best way that we can get those is through survey data. So we can get additional information about demographics, offline activities and contacts, political variables, or psychological traits that we cannot get, or at the very least not directly get, from social media or other digital traces. So the ideal data set, if you will, would be a longitudinal perspective across different platforms, and with the additional information about the individuals that you can gather through surveys. And how can you get to this ideal data set? Well, essentially there are two ways in which the linking can proceed. You can start from the survey data, and in the survey, invite people to share their social media data with you. Or you can go the other way. You can collect social media data, and then through that, or other digital platforms, through that online platform, advertise and recruit participants for your survey. Of course, notably, each of these two options can or does introduce a specific kind of bias. And I think many of you might have heard the term of the total survey error framework. And there's a really interesting paper by some of our GESIS colleagues that applies this to digital behavioral data and talks about this in detail. What are some other dimensions that ways of linking can differ on? First of all, the general temporal sequence. And this doesn't relate to what you start from, but the general data collection process. You can collect data specifically for the purpose of linking. So you can collect them together, typically for the same units of observation. And this is what we would call ex ante or direct linking. So the data are collected together to be linked. Or in the case when at least one of the data sets already exists, so the survey data is already there and you collect the social media data, or vice versa, or both already exist, so it's secondary data use, then this would constitute what we call ex post linking. And of course, you can link the data on different levels. It can be on the individual level, which is what most social scientists are interested in, right? And the example from Resnick and colleagues was exactly that. You have individual level data across different platforms plus the survey data. But it can, of course, also be on the aggregate level. So you can have aggregated survey and or social media data for specific geographic regions, periods of time, or topics, for example, through hashtags. Now, some of the practicalities of the linking, though it might seem trivial, right? You need an identifier or a combination of identifiers to link the survey data with the digital trace data or digital behavioral data. If we're talking about social media data, of course, usernames would be an obvious example. But as I will show you in a bit also from our own research, there is a risk of failure because people might misreport simply because they misremember or because they want to intentionally provide false answers, misreport user handles, for example. A potential solution for that, just as a small footnote here, is that if you go this way, you can have people follow or message an account that you created for the purpose of the study. This is one way to circumvent the issues of misreported usernames. What identifiers make sense, of course, heavily depends on what digital trace data we're talking about, how these are collected, and how they are linked with the survey data. In this paper that we've recently published, we talk about some of these issues, especially related to informed consent. And we look at these three platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, with some examples from our own research. And for Twitter, you have your user handle, and most people know that, but you can also log in all three of those platforms using your email address. So many people, especially the more casual users, might not even, or the people who only use it passively, might not even know their Twitter handle because they always log in with their email address if they do it on a desktop. And if they have the app, they usually only need to log in once they start using the app. The usernames on Facebook and LinkedIn are typically people's real names, especially on LinkedIn. And if your name is, I don't know, Adam Smith, there's probably a lot of people named Adam Smith. So this is not a good unique identifier to connect people from in the survey data and the social media data in that case. All of these platforms do have stable user IDs, which are numeric, but almost none of the users know their user IDs. So if you want to use that for linking, you have to gather that, for example, in the case of Twitter, through the API. And if you use external tools, so if you don't go through the API, for example, of a platform, this may require some additional unique identifiers. And I'm going to give you an example of what that means in a bit. Right, so there are, I already mentioned this, some challenges, practical challenges, but also legal and ethical challenges when you want to combine survey data with digital behavioral data. To give you one example, practical example from our own research, we did some research where we had data from a web tracking panel. So people who opted in to have their web traffic tracked for a certain amount of time, roughly 2,000 participants per month. There was a refresher of this sample every month. And the data is from June 2018 to May 2019. And we invited these people from that tracking sample to participate in some online surveys. And in those surveys, we included requests to link their Twitter data, Facebook data, and Spotify data with their web tracking and survey data. And we did this in different ways. For Twitter, we used the API, and we asked people for their usernames. Facebook, we used an external tool, a browser plugin that was created by a collaborator of ours that people had to install, and that collected information about the public posts they saw in their feed. And for Spotify, we used a web app also created by a collaborator from another university that collected also, it worked through the API, but technically people had to log in with their account on the web page. We provided people with a short informed consent in the questionnaire, and then we had some extended privacy information that was linked. And if you're interested in the language for that, the paper that I just mentioned has the complete informed consent language, as well as some other model language from research from the UK. So what did we actually get? And yeah, this is a bit of a complicated flowchart, I admit. We see here, if you look at the number of, the percentage of people that have a Twitter account, that this was fairly high for Germany. Usually, if you look at representative surveys about Twitter use, those are like low single digits numbers in Germany. So we have a higher share of Twitter users, had a higher share of Twitter users in our sample. And from those 60, a bit more than 65% agreed to sharing their Twitter data with us, which is fairly high. And then what's interesting here as well is that even among those that consented, not all of them in the end provided the Twitter handle that worked. And there were different issues. People had typos in there. Some people actually put in their email address because that's what they use to log in. Some people obviously put in Twitter handles that were not theirs. So we also have dropout, if you will, or data loss at this stage, even among the people who have a Twitter account and consented to sharing their data. For Facebook, we have a much higher share. Again, this is also somehow somewhat specific to Germany. About 80% of the people in the sample do use Facebook. We did have, this is the receive plugin question bit here, we did have some technical issues with the Facebook plugin. That's why not everybody received a question. Unfortunately, this happened during data collection. Bit less than 60% then of those who received the question agreed to install the plugin. But not everybody did, again, for various reasons. So again, here, because this was a different procedure, we also have dropout even at these later stages where people already agreed to use the tool. And for Spotify, again, the share of users is about similar to what we have for Twitter. And there we had the highest willingness to share, probably also because people found those data to be the least sensitive. But again, also there were some technical issues that prevented an actual match in the IDs from happening here at the later stage, as this was an external tool as well. So what we also looked at what characteristics or factors predict the willingness to share the data. Across the board, we found that younger users are more likely to share the data. People who more frequently use these platforms are more likely to share, and respondent burden is an important factor. So for Facebook, people had to use the browser plugin. This was more effort than just providing their screen name. And it was also limited only to desktop use. And another study that some of our colleagues here at GESIS did with a German non-probability online panel, and if you're interested in the details, you can have a look at the preprint that's linked here. They also found that a higher incentive leads to more sharing. Again, they found that respondent burden was a very important factor, and additional factors that they found was a positive survey evaluation and affinity for technology increased the chances or the likelihood of people agreeing to sharing their social media data. So apart from these practical issues, there are also quite a few legal and ethical factors that you need to consider when you want to link survey and digital behavioral data. For example, on the legal side, contractual agreements, depending on how you collect the data, for example, through an API, these usually have terms of service, and they may or may not allow or restrict the linking with other types of data. There's questions about informed consent, how can it be obtained and what should it look like, but also the issue of data privacy, of course, how to protect these data as they have a high disclosure potential and can be quite sensitive. You don't have to read through all of this, but just one example from the Twitter developer policies. They do have a section where they explicitly say that matching with or linking with off-Twitter data is limited, and that you should have an opt-in consent from the person, and if not, then this is limited to specific types of data. Information provided by these individuals or public data in this case. For informed consent, of course, there are different legal regulations depending on where you're situated and where your research is carried out. In Europe, the standard that needs to be followed is the General Data Protection Regulation. And you should also take care to satisfy ethical standards, as, for example, defined by an IRB or by professional societies in your field. The practical challenge with creating these informed consent is that you need to find a balance between providing the right and appropriate information that is required without overwhelming the respondents with too many technical details. And of course, thinking back about these temporal sequences of the linking process, it is easier to obtain informed consent when you start with the survey data because you can ask for informed consent in that survey. And again, if you're interested in some suggestions on how to design the informed consent and some exact wording, then our paper and the paper by Luke Sloan and colleagues that this work is largely based on, he's also a co-author in the other paper, is probably a helpful resource for you. With regard to data privacy, as these data are potentially quite disclosive and can be sensitive, they should be stored and handled in a way that that minimizes disclosure risk. Of course, you should employ the usual data protection measures like passwords, access control, or encryption. But for these combined data, it is also advisable to keep them separate as much as possible in your actual workflow. And what does that mean? So this figure is again based on some work by Luke Sloan and colleagues. You start with the data set. This assumes that this is individual level data, and you start from the survey. So if you, in the survey, for example, ask for a user ID, so the number 1 in this figure, and then you use that user ID to collect the digital traces. You have 2 data sets, right? You have a survey data set with the username in it, and you have a, let's say, Twitter data set with the username in it. Then from that survey data set, you should remove the username and only combine what is necessary and not the full raw data. So that's the bottom line of this. There shouldn't be a combined data set where all of the raw data sources with all of the identifiers are combined. They should be stored separately and only combined when it's necessary for analyses. And this can be done through working with and creating lookup tables that have a, let's say you have a numeric survey ID, and then you have the survey ID and an ID for the social media or digital trace data. And then you can work with lookup tables to process these data and create new variables. Again, we wrote a GESA survey guideline where we talk about this in a bit more detail, and it's linked at the bottom of this, and then you can have a look there, or at the paper by Sloan and colleagues for some more details on this proposed workflow. And with that, I'm gonna hand back to Sebastian for the final part of our presentation.
And we have 2 more slides. So there are, of course, many practical issues when trying to link surveys and digital behavioral data. And one of the more convenient solutions for researchers is to get access to commercial tracking providers, so commercial online access providers who also have a tracking component in their samples that is already implemented. So these people have given their informed consent. They installed their tracking tools on their computers, and then their web browsing behavior is tracked. So you go, for instance, to YouGov or the German company Respondi, and you ask them for a price. So you want to get the tracking data, and then you can also survey these people for whatever constructs that you need for your study. The problem is that these services are really expensive, that you need a DFG grant or other type of funding to actually use such data for your research. So that is not something that is easily available for most of us. If you want to do such tracking studies on your own, and Johannes already told you about our attempts with tracking tools that tracked Facebook behavior, for instance, you also run into lots of problems. So this is usually requires very complex, expensive, and also difficult to secure server infrastructure. So a backend and a front end where the data is actually provided in a very safe manner. And this is also costly and requires IT competencies that we as social scientists typically do not have. Another problem with accessing people who are already active on online platforms is that these platforms make it really hard to survey their users. I think Johannes talked briefly about it. If you want to set up a survey on Twitter, you would have to, for instance, mention these people, hey, do you want to participate in my survey? And you have to do that at a large scale in order to get to achieve a significant sample. But the problem is that Twitter will regard this as malicious activity and most likely block the accounts that you are using for contacting people. So just going to online platforms and surveying people is also associated with challenges, but there are also opportunities. For instance, the Facebook ads system could be used to advertise surveys to people. And with a clever opt-in option, it might be able to also link these surveys with their Facebook data. But we at GESIS are, of course, also aware of these challenges, and we are working on solutions already. So we think that a long-term academic tracking infrastructure is needed. We need to have one place where social scientists can go, submit their research questions, survey items, etc., and be able to get tracking data, for instance, web browsing behavior. And there are plans for digital behavioral data access panel at GESIS, where such DBD studies will be implemented and linked with survey data. So that is something, so it's also recent news for us that we will get funding for this. And we can promise you that in the next 1 to 3 years, there will be novel services at GESIS that you as social scientists can then also use to conduct tracking studies. So please stay tuned and stay with us. To summarize, linking these two data types, surveys and DBD, have advantages, but there are also significant challenges. So these different types of linking designs, ex ante, ex post, all have certain challenges that are difficult to resolve. And these are usually ethical challenges, technical challenges, and also practical challenges. Also funding is an important aspect if you want to conduct such studies. But at least we now have some guidelines. We know what works. There needs to be a solid informed consent form, definitely. And we also have provided these guidelines for linking surveys and digital behavioral data that Johannes mentioned. And there is also a whole special issue, Stier et al. 2020 here in the journal Social Science Computer Review, where you can find 8 studies that have used such linkage designs in order to get some inspiration, what is possible with these types of data, and also get to know more of these challenges and solutions for these challenges. And with that, we conclude our talk. We really look forward to the discussion with you. Thank you for listening.